Is Zoom able to hear us now? Yeah, okay. That was one technology fix I could do. Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Great. Okay, thanks, Terry, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Bonnie, Emily, and Ramsey for setting this all up for us. I also want to thank all of you for joining today. I'm really grateful for this chance to share some of my work and to learn from your feedback and questions. As Terry acknowledged, we're gathered today on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territories of the Musqueam. This is also where I do most of my living and learning. I've also had the chance to spend some time learning on Newholt territory, which has really benefited the work I'll be sharing today. And I just really appreciate that chance. It's also been a great benefit to my PhD experience. Today, I'm going to provide an overview of my general research and then dive deeper into one chapter, which is based on the Restorative Diets project that I've been working on with Terry and Rochelle Beveridge, who is a postdoc in IRES and is based up on the Central Coast. Generally, my research is motivated by reports from First Nations within British Columbia that they do not have enough access to fish to care for their communities. This quote comes from a paper authored by Central Coast First Nations representatives and is specific to salmon, though similar sentiments have been shared by First Nations all along the coast and across fishes, including ulikin and herring, for example. As a public health researcher, I've had the opportunity to work with communities to explore the implications of what this means for their well-being to not have enough fish. During my PhD, I've been interested in understanding the factors that contribute to this situation, especially considering that First Nations have long-standing relationships with these fish and distinct rights that flow from those relationships. The factors are multiple. Anyone who's familiar with fisheries knows that. There's destruction of spawning habitat, overfishing, interruption of stewardship practices, ocean temperatures, harmful algal blooms, just to name a few. And there's a lot of potential for those to interact with each other and to create cumulative effects. Through readings and conversations, I encountered statements such as this quote from Darwin Douglas, that specifically pointed to fisheries governance, which started under a colonial government and has continued under federal regulations. And these statements look at how these regulations are one of those factors and really forefronting those and not wanting them to be overlooked as we consider the others. And this statement prompted me to turn my research gaze towards the fisheries management strategies and governance priorities of the Crown. I'm looking at them through a lens of food justice informed. Food justice encourages us to consider the systemic nature of barriers to food access and also encourages us to think about how people who are in power can use food and food systems to solidify power structures, to limit the opportunities for people to disrupt and resist the status quo. I'm broadly asking how fisheries management strategies and governance priorities that have been determined and imposed by the Crown contribute to barriers to First Nations food access and might limit options for disrupting colonial power structures. And these questions have taken me in a few different directions, one of which is the Restorative Diets project, which I'm going to be sharing more of today. I'm sharing a paper that I wrote with Rochelle and Terry based on this project, and it's a paper that's currently under review. As the first paper from the project, we introduced the concept of restorative diets and the methods that we developed, and then apply the methods at the coast-wide scale. The project and paper have been motivated and guided by staff and member nations of the Central Coast First Indigenous Resource Alliance. And I want to personally thank members of the Newholt stewardship team who have welcomed me and provided us space to share this project and paper during their meetings and open houses. First Nations are reasserting their governance authority in incredible ways up and down the coast, including reasserting authority over fishing within their territories and taking a leading role in determining efforts to restore fish populations and their habitat. Restorative diets describe diets that would be accessible to First Nations under the interdependent processes of renewing Indigenous governance systems and restoring ecological systems. And we're seeing diets as a component of both that restoration and renewal. We came to work on restorative diets because we were asked to bring together evidence that Central Coast First Nations could use to set and assert their stewardship and restoration goals, and also evidence that First Nations could use to prompt a serious conversation about the fair distribution of available fish, fair both in process and also in outcome. I'm going to try to give you a quick blitz on how federal management right now handles fisheries. They usually start from determining how many fish can be taken from a given population. They try to set that so that enough fish are left to sustain or rebuild fish populations to a healthy level. And I'm not going to pretend that that is not itself a contested and controversial process. I'm going to save it for another time because our focus, especially in this paper, is more so on the distribution of those fish. So the fish that end up within that box, that they're considered harvestable. For First Nations with whom the Crown has no treaty agreement, the federal government has determined that fishing for the purposes of food, social, and ceremonial, or FSC fishing, happens under a communal license, and that is issued to the nation through an Aboriginal fisheries strategy. These licenses set a maximum number of fish that can be harvested. By allocating a set amount of fish to FSC fisheries, the federal government argues that it has taken seriously that constitutional right to fish and frees up the remaining amount, for other fisheries. However, there are concerns that the fisheries management and allocation decisions are being based on deeply disrupted diets and practices. So the setting of that orange box. As just one example of what a disruption might be, early management actions taken under the Fisheries Act banned and destroyed Indigenous ways of fishing, such as fishing weirs, like the one shown here. These technologies can harvest large amounts of salmon. They also allow for really specific monitoring and selective harvesting of salmon as they're returning to their homes. And historical records show there were dramatic drops in the amount of salmon First Nations harvested following the banning of these ways of fishing. If we think about the amount of fish harvested by First Nations through time as this blue curve, knowing that it continues much farther this direction, thousands and thousands of years, we can think about the banning of fish weirs as this drop-off. The concern we were hearing is that the evidence the federal government uses when allocating fish comes from a narrow time frame that misses some of the most dramatic disruptions to these systems. And it is that evidence that is being used to set expectations and goals for the fish accessible to First Nations. Instead, we were being asked to bring together historical evidence that could reflect less disrupted diets and practices that could be used by First Nations to set and assert their own governance goals, what we are calling restorative diets. And you might recognize this type of curve if you're familiar with Daniel Pauly's concept of shifting baselines, which describes how using narrow, short timeframes and reference to highly disrupted systems can affect the trajectories of our goals. Our research goals were therefore to first explore how harvest rates consistent with diets of coastal First Nations, what those might look like, restorative diets. Second, to shed light on the gap between restorative and disrupted diets, and to provide methods. And finally, to look at the extent to which contemporary assessments of needs may be underestimated with repercussions. Going back to the diagram, first goal is setting the purple line. The second is looking at the difference between, and the third is thinking about the implications of the difference of goals. I'm going to go a little faster because I'm short on time, but there are a few different constraints on the methods. One was we were asked to do this work as much as possible with existing literature and data because of COVID concerns. Also, we were really wanted to be aware that a lot of First Nations keep their fisheries data internal. So we wanted to create a method that they could use internally with their own data, kind of as a handing off of the method more so than the findings themselves. That led us to take more of a methods approach. And I will say here, to ground this approach, we focused in on salmon. We were looking at the full coast. And so salmon is really important across the coast. As Terry mentioned, I also really love salmon. I have a relationship that kind of throughout my life, salmon has been part of my life. And so sometimes makes sense to stick with what you know. So that's where we started. And we used a modeling approach where we had caloric demand, proportion of historical diets from salmon, and the amount of harvested salmon per calorie. We used those three variables to set the approximate rate of salmon harvest to support restorative diets. And even though I'm rushing, I want to note that because we are using caloric demand, these estimates are only reflecting fish that are eaten. It doesn't reflect the many other ways salmon support First Nations and is in no way an upper bound. We use the existing literature to set distributions of likely values for each variable. So these can be kind of read like histograms where the peak is the most likely value. Repeatedly sampled from those to populate the equation and took the middle central 50% of the resulting rates. And that was the range that we came to for the harvest rates. We performed 4 checks of reasonableness. The first was we compared our rate, which is on the top, to other conceptually similar rates in the literature, with the median and the interquartile range shown here. We also asked if it was even safe to eat that much salmon, looking at toxicities. We looked at what % of returning salmon would be harvested if First Nations harvested at these rates. And then finally, we checked in with knowledge holders. So this is a photo from our setup at the New Hulk Stewardship Office open house. We also presented during meetings with stewardship offices and representatives. Finding that we passed kind of those 4 checks, our resulting range was from 65 to 235 kilograms of salmon harvested per person per year. That's about 15 to 73 salmon. And these 6 illustrations show how different dietary practices and caloric demands might be expected to contribute to this wide range, especially considering we are looking across many different peoples and ways of life along the coast. Looking at the second research goal of comparing this rate to the rates that would be suggested by contemporary evidence, that orange line, we found 3 sources when we were reviewing the literature that offered rates at a similar geographic scale that we were working at. And all 3 also represent the type of evidence the federal government is supposed to be considering when looking to set those allocation amounts. So the first is recent catch for food, social, and ceremonial fisheries. The second is recent allocation, how much was allocated last year. And then the third is contemporary diets, so how much fish are people eating currently. Again, because our restorative diets estimate is specific to eating, the far one with the orange square around it is the most conceptually comparable to the rates we're arriving at. And this is just to show the magnitude of the gap between the rates that would be suggested by these contemporary evidence, lines of evidence, and then the median of our restorative diets. And so we found a sizable and consistent gap. For a community of 500 people, these gaps are about 13 to 17,000 more fish per year. So thinking about what that might mean going forward. And we're also offering this finding again to prompt conversation about the fair distribution of the fish who are available for harvesting, and also wanting to start to question some of the evidence that is being used to determine that distribution. Through this work, our main contributions were developing a method to bring multiple lines of evidence together, including evidence of pre-colonial and historical dietary use. Again, the focus of this method was for First Nations to be able to use it in setting and asserting their own governance goals. We did find a sizable and consistent gap between harvest rates for restorative diets and rates suggested by contemporary evidence. Which highlights how privileging evidence of contemporary use in making decisions about allocation may support continued depression of access for First Nations. Looking forward to next steps, we are working with individual First Nations to refine the method and the estimated range of harvest rates, and are looking at applying this approach to other species and working to include other uses such as trade or ceremonies. I want to extend additional thanks to members of Terry's research group and the project team I'm a part of, along with my committee members and funding. And thank you all for listening. I look forward to your questions. Yeah, Mark.
So what would it look like in that type of X level concerns and all the
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a few different ways to answer, and the question is, what would it look like to shift to that level of harvest, considering some of the challenges with current return levels. You also spoke to some of the capacity in the communities as well. Is that? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so there's definitely multiple factors kind of affecting how many fish end up in that box. And so a lot of the population declines that you're seeing with salmon, there's so many factors coming in. And so with this work, really looking at how the distribution within those that have been determined to be harvestable was the focus. We did check to see what level of returns that would be. That was a bit tricky just because you have to go from a per person to, you have to have a human population and then understand which salmon populations they're targeting. Roughly with that very rough calculation, it was 1 to 3% of returning salmon. So it still is a relatively low percentage of the returning salmon. But that's not to say there aren't also concerns within nations that more salmon should be coming back and that more salmon should be being protected. So this estimate can also be used to push for more protection for salmon. And if there's a rate of harvest that feels acceptable, you could use it to build up from there and say, okay, if you're willing to take 1% and that feels sustainable, then how many need to be getting back to these terminal streams? So it's also has been used in more of a restoration conversation around what should our restoration goals be for certain streams as well. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dan.
Thank you so much for that. That's so clear. Well, presented. So, I'm wondering, I'm thinking about hatcheries right now, and I'm wondering if your conversations and so far in presenting these results, like what are indigenous folks saying about their preferences? I know it's hard to speak on behalf of many people, but just from what's come up in conversations, is there like a clear preference for wild caught versus hatchery fish? Is there a rejection of those fish, and are there conversations about how to address this that either do or don't involve hatcheries?
Yeah, so the question is relating to hatcheries and perception of hatchery fish and wild fish, and what role might hatchery fish play in reaching some of these levels of harvest. And as you noted, varying perspectives on hatcheries, myself included. From day to day, I feel like I have landed a different spot. So I don't know that I'd be able to share any specific perceptions of hatcheries and hatchery fish. I will say a tool like this, and then also just the general purpose behind it, was really to support and provide tools for First Nations to govern that themselves. And so I would say that having decisions around hatcheries and adding hatcheries to systems and hatchery fishes need to be decisions that are made with full consultation, if not complete management by the First Nations. And yeah, of kind of a non-answer, but who has control and say over those decisions, I think, is important. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about kind of the units that were being used, I think on the general curve that, on the slide with the curve of showing the decline. The units there was number of fish. And that was very much just a rough representation. But you did bring up that the size of the fish has also changed, which actually was one of the very first. As I was doing this, I was like, wait, these nations are being allocated the same amount of fish year to year, but the size of the fish have changed dramatically. And so the amount of actual food that is coming out of that allocation is shifting. So it's a great point, and just another one of those cases where by just carrying things forward, you can actually have declines in access. So thank you. All right, that was the end. Thank you all.